joining us now to speak about this. Constitutional law expert and political analyst, Professor Richard Calland. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Richard. Firstly, let me start with, I asked you to chat to us about it because you were asking on social media, why is this not a bigger story?
Yes, Sabisa, good evening to you. Thank you for having me on. I raised the question on Twitter because it struck me as extraordinary that a world leader at the center of such a conflict should have such an apparently absurd position hanging over him. And that position is that the very group that he accuses of being the main aggressor against Israel, namely Hamas, the people who perpetrated the horrors of October the 7th attack on Israel, he was funding, his government was funding, and for a long period of time, that $1 billion in cash paid through Qatar was being channeled to them in an attempt to divide and rule the Palestinian project. And that's now come out with very clear evidence from people in the know, and it seems that evidence is solid. Of course, it has to be tested in a court of law and all of that. But this rumor that's been circulating around now for several months, if not longer, has now been substantiated or corroborated by some witnesses speaking on that documentary.
And it's been said that these rumors, these allegations have been around for quite a while now, that they're actually widely known. How much bigger are Benjamin Netanyahu's actions just in terms of the bigger system where war, energy and power are tightly linked?
I think that's a very powerful question. It's so interesting that we're speaking on the day that the Israeli Knesset parliament has apparently passed a piece of law that will discriminate against Palestinian prisoners who have been convicted or face charges concerning very serious charges, and that they will face the death penalty, and that Israeli combatants or Israeli criminal offenders will not. Now, that's been immediately condemned by many human rights groups around the world. What it raises is a question about the quality and the integrity of the democratic system in Israel. It suggests that the country is really gone off the rails, and it's gone off the rails, if it has, because of one man, and that is Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it seems to me that those people who draw interesting historical parallels with historical figures like Otto von Bismarck, the German Iron Chancellor of the 19th century, do so because, like Bismarck, what Netanyahu has done very skillfully is make himself in a sense, indispensable. He said, I'm the man that must protect Israel. I'm the man that must defend Israel. I'm the man that must lead Israel to a safer place. And that he therefore pushes aside the constitutional niceties and the rule of law in order to preserve his power in political office. And that's an extraordinary thing, that one person, a bit like Trump, can have such huge impact on the world. Not just within his country, but now, of course, within the region, with Israel being a serious aggressor in the Iranian conflict that has emerged in recent weeks.
It leads one then to the question that if the global system rewards instability, oil markets, security alliances, currency dominance, is any leader actually incentivized to pursue peace?
Another powerful question. And of course, a real leader will always pursue peace. And somebody who is weak and somebody who has things to hide, who cannot lead through integrity, will find ways, or have to find ways if they want to survive in politics and in power, by distracting everybody. And in a sense, that is precisely what Jacob Zuma tried to do when he was perpetrating that thing known as state capture here in South Africa. It's what Trump is doing in relation to the Epstein files and the allegations of paedophilia raised against him and many others, and of course also Netanyahu in his own country. And this is nothing new, that political leaders will sometimes use distraction tactics of the most egregious kind in order to preserve their own political skin, as it were.
So, Richard, these Bibi Files point to his role in the war on Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, to his warnings for decades that Iran is years away from a nuclear bomb. But others are saying, was this a genuine miscalculation or a politically useful narrative to build on a real threat?
Well, I think the scenario or the theory that is put forward by some that Netanyahu has been waiting for that sort of sweet spot, that optimal moment where there is an American president willing to use American military power alongside or in cahoots with Israeli belligerents in the region in order to try and secure victories. The question, the real strategic question, is will any of that succeed? Will Israel be safer and more secure as a result of any of this bellicosity and violence and conflict, ranging from the Gaza genocide through to this proxy war that seems to be being fought by Israel in many ways on Israel's behalf? Will that make the state of Israel and Israelis and even Jewish people around the world any safer than before? And I think there has to be a really serious questioning of that proposition in light of what is happening and the really serious allegations that are made, not just against Netanyahu, but against Israel, which has always tried to present itself as the democracy of the Middle East. It's not behaving like a democracy at the moment, not by any means.
And it's interesting that you draw that distinction between Bibi Netanyahu and Israel, because those who are fingering him as the problem and kind of dragging Israel along. But more importantly is the intelligence assessments. During Iraq, that question was asked, and even now the question is being asked if real intelligence is being used and who is being listened to, because it's being painted that his policy on funding Hamas was a strategic containment to prevent unity with Fatah. Just your thoughts on this. Is there a dangerous gamble that's backfiring?
Well, I remember my own first visit to Palestine and to Israel in 1999, just before the turn of the century, when the Oslo Accord was in play, and there was talk of a real two-state solution. And Prime Minister Sharon, was clearly against it, and he pulled off a stunt that created the second Intifada, which started when I happened to be in the country. And it was brutal to watch, and it led to a huge number of deaths, mainly on the Palestinian side, and a major setback to the two-state solution, from which I think there hasn't been a serious recovery. Netanyahu has prolonged that, and it's clear from his game plan and now the evidence of him funding and arranging for the funding of Hamas, that he wanted to divide and rule. He wanted Hamas in power in Gaza, and he wanted Fatah, the other main faction within the Palestinian liberation movement and government and politics, to be in control of the West Bank, and that way create a real division in Palestine, an already hugely divided place, much like apartheid South Africa, a comparison that, of course, Netanyahu and the Israeli government would balk at, but which many observers who have been to Israel and Palestine would say is a very apt comparison with the homeland states of apartheid South Africa, divided and split up by an authoritarian government that has no real intent to bring justice or human rights to those Palestinian citizens.
Benjamin Netanyahu had a corruption trial that was underway before October 7. So these files coming out now, as I mentioned in the beginning, those who are for it and those who are against it, saying that it's just a selective rubbishing of Netanyahu. But from your point of view, was he making national security decisions or just mere political survival?
Well, it may be quite hard to discern the difference between the two. And of course, part of the web of both political posturing and branding and misinformation is to cloud the issue. And to, as I said right at the beginning of this interview, in my first answer to you, Zabisa, that what an artful and malignant politician such as Netanyahu will try and do is mask their real intent and purpose and interest by presenting themselves as sort of a greater leader with a greater purpose, like Bismarck, as I suggested earlier. And that's precisely what Netanyahu has done and has continued to do in order to avoid justice, in order to muddy the water, and in order to develop a sort of popularity. And it seems to be working, on the face of it at least, that Israelis seem to be largely behind his approach, that certainly in terms of the response to October 7th and the genocide in Gaza, the numbers suggest, the polling suggests that a large number of Israelis support it. So something very sinister, I would suggest, and warped has happened within Israeli society. And Netanyahu is at the center of that. And history later will judge him, no doubt, as to his role in leading Israel into this position that it now finds itself. And I would argue it's a predicament. It's not a position of strength and security and long-term sustainability. Far from it.
And speaking of on the face of it, Saudi Arabia's role, there are claims that it's benefiting without fighting. Are we seeing the region's power balance being reshaped in ways that the public isn't fully seeing?
Look, I'm not an expert in the politics of the Middle East or West Asia, as some people prefer to call it now. And those politics are complex, but I observe it with as much care and attention as I can. And even today, it's interesting to note the meeting involving Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt, a sort of gang of four, so to speak, that have been held a meeting with their foreign ministers for a whole day, I think, yesterday. And what you're seeing there with that kind of maneuver is that the Arab countries of the region are trying to avoid a situation where they are pulled into a conflict which is extremely harmful to them. We've seen the response that Iran has made to the attacks from Israel and the United States. That response has caused a great deal of harm to the interests of Arab and Gulf states. And of course, on one analytical lens, through one analytical lens, Israel benefits from that because that divides the Arab world. It creates disharmony and discord. And I think what you're seeing now is a pushback against that. And leadership is going to have to be shown by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and so on. These kinds of countries are going to have to find a common strategy to stabilize the region and to confront, frankly, Israeli and US power meddling in their affairs and causing a huge amount of instability, not to mention conflict and loss of life.
And said to be at the center of that power is a global oil system. Is it a driver, the dominance of the US dollar, the global oil system, an unspoken driver behind the repeated conflict in the region?
Well, that is often said to be the case, and yet my own analytical instinct to that is that is not the only driver. It's not as simple as that. It's hard, for example, at the moment to figure out exactly what President Trump and the US's game plan is, if that is the purpose here, because at the moment what one's seeing is of course, great instability in the global energy system and harm being done to US consumers ultimately, as well as many other consumers, despite what Trump said. He has unleashed through this war a huge global economic kind of tidal wave or negative tidal wave. The ramifications and consequences of which are unpredictable and hard, if not impossible, to control. And so he's unleashed that. And putting the genie back in the bottle, I think, is going to be an extremely difficult task. You can see now the backpedaling, the attempt to try and secure the Strait of Hamas in order to release the supply of oil to Asian countries in the main who desperately need it. That's one very foreseeable consequence. And I think, Bisa, you will have, I'm sure, along with many others, raised your eyebrows at the idea from Trump and others that this was unexpected. Anyone with, I think, half a brain cell would have predicted that kind of squeeze from Iran would have been one of the ways in an era of asymmetric warfare that they would have responded to their attacks upon their country and their sovereignty under international law.
The Bibi Files, it lays out documented facts, but you know, the narrative goes further, particularly online. In today's media ecosystem, the influence it'll have on how people view not only what is happening with Iran, in Iran at the moment, but who Benjamin Netanyahu is, his legacy. Will it have a big dent, do you think? Will people focus on evidence and or interpretation?
Well, certainly one of the reasons I was very happy to agree to this interview is because I know that as an interviewer, you are always willing to try and ask difficult questions and get under the skin of an issue. Very few mainstream media organizations are willing to take that pursuit on. And of course, it's not necessarily easy for two reasons. One is the problem of resourcing in the media and so on, and weaknesses in newsrooms globally and so on. Secondly, of course, as you point to and allude to, in the ranks of social media, there is a vast amount of misinformation and fake news, which one has to wade through to try and figure out what is true and not true. And of course, as we all know, one of the old cliches of war is that truth is the first casualty of war. And so one has to be tremendously careful at a period like this of trying to discern what is accurate and truthful and what isn't. It would seem, if you compare what has been reported in so-called mainstream media, particularly from Western outlets, compared with some of the more reliable sources of information on Twitter and other forms of social media, that there are almost two different worlds here. There is one that plays according to an old playbook with kind of rather, I would say, out of date and staid kind of attitudes. For example, the reporting always in those outlets talks about the Iranian regime, but then refers to the Israeli government, for example. And I've already argued in this interview that the Israeli government now is handling power and perpetrating serious international and indeed national misdeeds and breaches of law that would, I think, easily cast it as a rogue state, and one that can no longer be described easily as a democracy.
Richard?
Certainly one that respects human rights.
It's a pity we've run out of time. It was good to chat to you. Thank you very much for your time and insights. Constitutional law expert and political analyst, Professor Richard Calland, speaking to us about the Bibi Files.